So our next speaker for our Roots of Dry Farming in the Western US panel is Steve Solomon. So Steve is in Tasmania, and I believe he will be joining us live for the Q&A, but we pre-recorded his presentation just to avoid any potential international kind of live streaming technology snafus. So for those of you, some of you may not be familiar with Steve, but I bet most of you have seen some of his books. So Water-Wise Vegetables, which I have here, Growing Vegetables West of the Cascades, and then Gardening Without Irrigation. There's multiple books, and Steve has been a resource when we started this project, referencing the books from our area, the Maritime Pacific Northwest. So been a great reference for the Dry Farming Collaborative, and one of the few resources out there when we got started in this exploration. So Steve is currently 78 years old, married to Anne, living on 11 hillside acres near a small community in northern Tasmania. Still grows a majority of the food they eat year round. And with that, Matt has our pre-recorded video, and Steve will be queuing you up as soon as the presentation, the recording of your presentation is over for a live Q&A. And Tegan, again, will be archiving or kind of compiling our questions to verbalize at the end, just to simplify things, since it looks like we have 116 people with us today. So and if you do turn your video off, it might help with improve the bandwidth and the quality of what you're seeing here. So with that, Matt, if you want to go ahead and share screen. All right, Steve Solomon, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you and have this conversation about how you got started in dry farming and what the resources were for you, and some of the maybe key takeaways that came from the books, Water-Wise Vegetables and Gardening Without Irrigation. So maybe we could start off, Steve, and have you tell us, maybe orient us in time and space to where you currently are, and then maybe tell us a little bit about how you got started, your interest in dry farming when you lived in Oregon.
Well, I'm speaking to you from a little remote community in the state of Tasmania, which is an island south of the big island up there we call Australia. And people in Tasmania often feel that they're another country down here, in the same way that Oregon was when I moved to Oregon. It was the tale of a huge dog that didn't really care about the folks that lived in that strange rainy climate. And we needed to work out our own methods and systems, and we didn't find them in mainstream garden books. And we didn't even find the seeds that we needed in mainstream seed companies in the 1970s. So Tassie is a lot like that, and I've had a similar function here since I've been here. And I write and publish a local book here called Growing Vegetables South of Australia, which helps people deal with this climate. And I've encouraged the foundation of a couple of local seed companies down here that do a much better job of giving us the cultivars we need. But I'm dealing with a population of 500,000 people on a remote, temperate South Pacific island.
So maybe you could kind of take us back in time a little bit to when you were living in Oregon and when you were actively exploring dry gardening at your spot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let me take you back just a little further than that. You didn't expect to go here, but I want to go back to when I first started vegetable gardening, which was in 1973. And my first garden teacher, my garden guru, actually taught the opposite of dry gardening. His name was John Jeevons, and he made himself quite a bit of money and fame publishing and republishing this book called How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible on Less Land Than You Ever Imagined. It is the Bible of French intensive gardening. And I started out gardening that way. And I thought that to garden, I needed virtually unlimited amounts of water and fertility, and that I could produce everything in a very small space. It never worked for me as well as John Jeevons touted the system. And I never succeeded at commercial market gardening using his system, even though I tried for a couple of years. So 5 years down the road, I moved to Oregon. And I bought 5 acres of east-facing hillside, eroded hillside, where all the topsoil had been lost by growing wheat, winter wheat, for nearly a century. And the land had degraded to the point that it didn't even pay to bale the hay from the skinny grass that grew on it. And much of that field in the next 10 years went back to Douglas fir. And I put in a vegetable garden, and I dug a well, and I discovered something that I didn't expect when I moved to Oregon, and that it is not rainy. It's only rainy for half the year. I didn't expect that. I also didn't expect that my well would be very disappointing well. It produced less than 3 gallons a minute when I needed the water. When I drilled it, when I bought the property subject to having at least 10 gallons a minute come out of the well, because I thought I would grow something, and I knew I could run a few big sprinklers and water half an acre or an acre with 10 gallons a minute, somehow or other. I ended up with a well that petered out as soon as I started needing the water. It did have 10 gallons a minute in the beginning. In fact, it had 15 gallons a minute in April. But by the end of June, I was down to about 3. And this made me insecure. And it also caused me to learn a great deal about irrigation and sprinklers and drip systems, especially when I went into the seed business. I had 2 gardens. The first one in 1978 was, I don't know, 5,000 square feet inside of a deer fence with raised beds. And that produced enough vegetables for the household. I could just barely irrigate that garden in the summertime by watering it all night for 3 nights, every week. There was a fair amount of clay in the soil, so it held moisture pretty good. But when I went into the seed business, I now found myself trying to run a half an acre trials ground on top of that. After a few years of watering all night, all the other nights with 1 sprinkler that put out about 3 gallons a minute and moving it in the middle of the night, I woke up every night at 2 o'clock in the morning and padded down there barefoot in the cold, wet dew, and moved the sprinkler and wiped my feet off and got back to bed and went to sleep again. And I did this for quite a few years. And then I discovered drip. And with drip, I could irrigate in the daytime. Anyway, there I was running a half an acre of trials. And one day, the pump failed. And that was quite an education. The garden, which was on a modified John Jeevan system, over the years, I had increased the spacing of the vegetables a little bit. I found it more convenient in various ways, but it still wasn't anything like dry gardening. Anyway, the pump failed. In 2 or 3 days, the vegetable garden by the house was really suffering. So they were under severe moisture stress. The vegetables in the trials grounds were not, and they didn't get watered for over a week, and they did not suffer. I didn't expect that. The reason they didn't suffer was the trials were not grown to produce food. They were grown to produce information. And I had to look at every plant. My concern was, if I grew 6 broccoli plants, are they all going to look the same? Are they all going to make a nice head of broccoli? Are all the heads of broccoli going to be about the same size? Will they all make side shoots? Is it a uniform variety? And so the plants were grown with enough interplant spacing that every plant had full opportunity to express itself. So big members of the cabbage family, for example, were 2 feet apart in rows 4 feet apart. That was the routine for them. Things like winter squash would be 8 feet apart in rows 8 feet apart. Carrots would be a double row of carrots, and they would be a foot apart. And the double row would be 4 feet from center to center to the next thing in the next row. All the rows were 4 feet apart. And the carrots would be thinned very carefully so that they were a couple inches apart. So I could see every carrot. So no carrot bumped any other carrot. I got to see exactly how each carrot would look. See, and I didn't, most of the food either got thrown on the ground after it got harvested or was given away to the people that worked in the seed business. I was not after the food. Anyway, in this circumstance, this garden went through a whole week with no problem until I started watering again. And I realized that maybe I could learn something here. And I started to think about how did the people in Oregon manage to grow vegetables in 1880? I mean, I knew one man who grew seed for me. He lived down in Canyonville, and he had the dream homestead. He had creek frontage. He had alluvial soil along the creek. It wasn't very wide, I mean, but he maybe had an acre or an acre and a half of actual alluvial soil along his creek frontage. And he had a hill, and up in the top of the hill was a spring. And he could actually pipe the water down from the spring with some pressure and irrigate his garden from that spring. But how many homesteads are there like that in Oregon? 1,000? I mean, how did people manage to grow a garden in Oregon back in the days when pumping water was a matter of pumping the well by hand or running a windmill? And bringing all that gear over would be very expensive. It would be beyond the ability of most people, especially in the early days. So that's where I got started. And I've always found in my life that a good question is worth 20 good answers. Always.
Mm-hmm.
So I started looking into it. And being in the seed business, I also was on the receiving end of anecdotal information. People would tell me, you know, there's somebody here doing this or that, or somebody's growing something unusual. Well, I heard about a guy around Grants Pass who grew magnificent carrots along the river there without any irrigation. How did he do that? I asked. Well, what he did was he planted the seed in the late spring while there was still enough soil moisture to germinate the seed. And the rows were 4 feet apart. And he thinned the carrots rather promptly to 1 foot apart in the row. And the carrots then grew all summer long without a drop of water. And by the end of the summer, they'd be huge. You know, he had big carrots this big around. And they said they were delicious. Well, that was strange. And then I started looking for more information. And I heard about a guy who wrote a book called The Desert Smells Like Rain. His name was Navahan. You're probably going to mention him in the proceedings here today. And so I got a copy of the book and I read it. And I read about Native American gardeners who were growing vegetables on a very brief seasonal rainy period in Arizona at the base of mountain ranges. Where there was a lot of runoff accumulated right at the foot of the hills. And we can assume that they had the right kind of soil there also that would hold that moisture. And they use incredibly big plant spacing. And I knew about that. And I thought, that's interesting. That's as far as it went. And then 1986, I sold the seed business. All the time I was running the seed business, I didn't really have time to do that. I didn't have time to do much investigation. Dealing with the business matters and doing the trials grounds was, you know, and having a marriage and all the other things a person does, that was all I could handle. But I sold the business. And after Isabel and I traveled around the world for a year and thought about where might we like to put our next homestead, as is a very typical thing with people going through a midlife crisis, we ended up 50 miles away from where we started. We spent 3 or 4 months in Hawaii. We spent 3 months in Israel. We spent a few months in California, and we ended up on the Elkton, Oregon, on the Umpqua River, on some very good soil in probably the most perfect microclimate there is in the state of Oregon and the best soil in the state of Oregon, as opposed to being in a cold, frosty upland valley in the Coast Range on some horrible soil with inadequate water. I had a well in Elkton that produced 25 gallons a minute. all year. It probably would have produced more if I put a larger pump in the hole. But 25 gallons a minute was always a gracious plenty. The soil was 25 feet deep. It was Malabon silty clay loam. It's probably the most productive agricultural soil in the state of Oregon. It's not necessarily the most fertile or the least fertile. I don't think fertility has much to do with productivity in Oregon because none of the soil there is very fertile. It's all leached very badly. Some worse than others, but I mean, even the best is none too good in terms of soil fertility. But it is a big moisture resource. You have 25 feet of soil with a fair amount of clay in it, but not so much clay that it's airless where the plants can make, and there's no beat horizon. So there's no impervious clay layer below what you're doing. And I didn't really fully appreciate what wonderful soil that was when I lived on it. It's only later after I've become a soil analyst that I really understand what a blessing it was to have that soil. But anyway, I put in a vegetable garden and was pretty busy for the first couple of years, just getting established in a new homestead and putting up a deer fence and enjoying the milder weather, the less frosty winters, the excellent soil resource, and learning how to use it very well. And then I started to find free time and decided that I would do some things that I'd always wanted to do when I was in the seed business, but I never had the time for, which was, you'll laugh, is to grow seed. Okay. I couldn't do that when I was in the seed business. I was a seed merchant. And the best I could do was contract with some of my neighbors sometimes to grow a bit of seed for me for something that was unusual. But doing the trials and running the business was about all you could take care of with a small business. So anyway, one of the seed things that was needed, I thought it was very needed at the time, would be a winter hardy Savoy cabbage of a large size that was open pollinated. At that time, I still was a bit stuck on this open pollinated versus hybrid kind of controversy that I don't believe in anymore. But I certainly did when I first went into the seed business. And I thought it would be good if I could have one that I could grow the seed for myself. There wasn't one. The only tasty open pollinated Savoy cabbage that there was called Chieftain Savoy. It was on all the seed racks. At one time, it was a commercial variety, but by 1988, 1989, it had degenerated to the point of complete non-productivity, and there was no point in even bothering with it. It was as bad as the Seco broccoli, Waltham 29 broccoli, Catskill, and Long Island improved Brussels sprouts. I mean, it was just a genetic mess and didn't produce anything. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll start with the best hybrid that I could find. And in those days, it was Savoy King. Savoy King's still available. We use it a lot here in Australia. It's produced in Japan. It's a thin leaf, tender, tasty cabbage that you can make sauerkraut out of if you want. You can make coleslaw out of it if you want. You can cook it if you want. It tolerates the frost all winter long. It doesn't burst readily. Savoy cabbage is whole without bursting because there's a little space in all those wrinkles for it to keep expanding without cracking. Very good variety. So I grew some Chieftains, some Savoy King, and at the end of the winter, I dug up 4 plants and put them by themselves somewhere where they could make seed, where I wasn't going to irrigate, because irrigation ruins seed quality. While the seed is drying down, if you keep watering it, you wreck the vigor of the seed. See, it needs to dry and dry very decisively and be done. So I put them outside the sprinkler throw range, and they reestablished and went ahead and bloomed and made seed, as they will. Except one plant did something that I'd never seen a cabbage do before. That's not to say it doesn't, it's actually rather normal. I'd just never seen it. In the midst of all those seed stalks, it started to form another cabbage. And I'd never seen that. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I just left it alone. And the cabbage grew and grew, and the seed stalks also grew and grew. And when the seed was done, I carefully cut them away from the cabbage and let that cabbage continue to form on the plant with no irrigation. And that cabbage grew for several more months through a very hot, dry summer. Elkton is hotter than it used to be up around Eugene or in the Willamette Valley. And it made a perfect cabbage. Beautiful cabbage. Tasted wonderful. I thought, how did that happen? You see. And so what happened, you'll excuse me for getting a bit spiritual on you. But see, I think God gave me a kick in the bum. I was handed a mission, a job to do. Why did that cabbage do that? And so I developed a lot more interest in the possibilities of dry gardening than I'd had before. And that's when I found Gary Nabhan's book. And that's when I started to actively investigate the possibility. And that's when I found another book. It was called Dry Farming by a man named Widstow, Widstoe. And that book's available for free download in the Soil and Health Library. And I hope that in the notes that you'll publish on this, the day that when we do all this online, that you'll have a reference to that book, and people are more than welcome to download it and read it.
Absolutely.
Widstow described a time in the United States back at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, when there were extensive areas that were still being dry farmed, when irrigation was much more unusual. And one of the crops that they used to grow by dry farming was potatoes. And they grew them in Idaho, southern Idaho, and where there's 10 inches of rainfall a year. And the way they grew those potatoes is that they had the rows 5 feet apart. And the potatoes were 18 inches apart in the row, each seed piece. And they carefully intertilled and controlled the weed crops, so there were no weeds. And they created what was called a dust mulch, where they had a layer of loose soil on the surface that actually functioned like a mulch, which prevented evaporation. And they got quite respectable yields of potatoes that way. He also talks about, if I remember the book right, it's been years since I read it, and I apologize if there's some minor mistakes in fact, because, you know, it's been a long time since I've looked at this information. But he talks a lot about how they grew winter wheat in the Palouse in Washington, where they actually could only grow one crop every other year. And they bare fallowed the land for 1 year, and it allowed the rainfall that did hit the ground to penetrate and enter the subsoil where it wouldn't be drawn back up by the plant roots. And they would store the rainfall in the subsoil for one whole year and then tap it and use it to grow a wheat crop the next year. And they got very respectable yields of wheat. These days, you know, we can drill deep wells, we can have cheaper energy, we pump water prolifically. We irrigate a whole lot of ground. But anyway, in those days, those were workable businesses. So that excited me as a possibility. Mm-hmm. So nobody had really dry farmed vegetables, except as far as I knew, those potatoes. And I couldn't find any handy guide where somebody told me how to do it already, because they'd already worked it out. My father used to tell me when I was a young man, and I'd ask his advice, or he tried to force it on me and I didn't want it. He would say, son, he'd say, learning by experience is very expensive. He didn't say this next bit, but it's true. You know, the experience that you get in your life costs you everything you got to get it. He said, son, he said, experience is very expensive, but the cheapest experience you can get comes secondhand if you'll only buy it when I give it to you for free, you know, which I didn't want. Anyway, I couldn't find anybody who was giving me secondhand experience about how to do this. So I had to figure it out myself. And so what I did is that I rotary cultivated up that autumn 2 rows outside of the garden where there was no irrigation. And I made the rows 5 feet apart. And I made them the width of a rotary cultivator. I had a walk-behind Honda in those days that tilled a 2-foot wide swath. And and I fertilized it with a very primitive version of the complete organic fertilizer that I recommend in my book. And I did that early in the spring while it was still rain, so I could carry that fertilizer into the ground. And then as the season came right, I started to plant that row. And I gave myself certain restrictions because it was a game. I just wanted to see how it would come out. So I wasn't going to use any water whatsoever. I was going to pretend that I had no irrigation. And the only water I would use would be a tea mug full to set out a couple of tomato seedlings. Excuse me, I learned to speak Australian. And here we don't say tomato, we say tomato. And I don't have an Aussie accent, but I have picked up the syntax and the vocabulary. And a few of the words that say the way the locals do. But everything else had to germinate on soil moisture and had to grow on soil moisture. So I planted some rutabagas. I almost said Swede here, sorry. What else did I plant? Carrots, endive. I thought endive might be a good one because it had a deep root. I planted tomatoes. I planted a short row of pole beans, not bush beans. I figured bush beans would probably be hopeless, but the pole beans might have a root system that sort of matched their top. Maybe it would have a bit more aggressive root system. I planted some kale plants, the Brassica oleracea type. And I planted some purple sprouting broccoli. And I planted that in the spring. Okay. And I grew all that stuff. Oh, and some beetroot. And everything grew really good. In summary, really quick, dry farming is just a point on a scale from wet farming. And it doesn't have to be absolute. It depends on having deep soil that retains a lot of moisture. There's a lot of places you won't succeed doing it. You have to look for older varieties that still have a lot of root system vigor. We've bred vegetables for irrigation ever since the 1940s. You get more vigor faster when you have a smaller root system. The plant can put more energy into the top. But you need the old stuff as much as possible. Pole beans are better than bush beans. Big cabbages, slow growing ones are better than little ones. Let's see, what else? You just have to accept the fact that there are these limitations, but you can actually produce a lot of food. If you have some irrigation, you want to reserve your moisture. If you have a tank or some water in storage, you want to save it up for starting the autumn-winter garden. You can save the moisture in the soil by keeping it bare all summer. You can till a piece of ground, get rid of the weeds, make a dust mulch. Don't let any weeds grow there and keep it bare until the end of July, early August, and then start your autumn garden with a little bit of water to get the seeds going until they get their roots down 4 or 5 inches into some soil that's still got moisture in it. So the subsoil is devoid of plant nutrients usually in Oregon. You got to get nutrients in there. Plants that do not have good nutrition look like they're water stressed. If you can get nutrients to them, they do a whole lot better. So there's a technique called fertigation, where basically they're using compost tea, or hopefully you'll be smarter than the people who practice the organic religion. And you'll actually make sure that you have a full balance of all the plant nutrients in that water, including all the trace elements, which you cannot get with fish emulsion and kelp. Yeah, you can learn a lot from the dope growers about this. They have some pretty good hydroponic sort of stuff that you can use to grow food with also. How's that for a 2-minute summary?
That was good. And maybe one more question that we might be able to still include in our 30 minutes is, I'd be curious, Steve, so you live in a completely different, on different soil in a different climate, a different part of the world now. Do you feel like any of your dry gardening lessons from your explorations in Elkton Does any of that transfer in helping to reduce your water use in Tasmania, or would you say there's
Oh, that's a good
transferable
question. I'll try to keep that to 1 minute, but I probably won't be able to. If we run over a minute, it won't ruin the life, will it?
Yeah, we can edit. So
Nobody will dry garden if they don't have to. Let's be frank. Okay, if you got water, you're going to want to use it. Dry gardening is a big handicap. It makes it all much more difficult. All the time that I've been here in Tassie, I've had plenty of water. And I'm 78. A year or so ago, Annie and I got very discontented living in suburbia on 2/4 acre blocks of the best soil in Tasmania. Okay, with water, municipal water, and although we wouldn't drink it and we wouldn't bathe in it, we had rainwater capture tanks for our household use, but we used the city water for the garden. And we got fed up with the whole thing, and we sold the place. And we're now, Annie's 80, and we're living on 11 acres in a little remote village called Chudley, Tasmania, on a hillside with 2 meters of loam soil beneath my feet. And all my water is coming out of rainwater capture tanks. And I'm again going to have to find some kind of a balance between absolute dry gardening and having all the water I might ever want. And so as you put the vegetables further and further apart, you can water them less and less often. And they can more and more draw upon the water that's already in the soil. Now, how well I'm going to do and how much water is going to rise by capillary action from this 2 feet of soil that's underneath my feet, I don't know. I have to learn this position, and I have to find out. Hopefully, I'll have another 10 years to find out a few things, but I'm going to be back to some kind of modified dry gardening again.
That'll be really interesting to hear, maybe hear from you after you've had some time to experiment there and hear about how your experiments went.
Yeah, well, isn't that interesting that I've come around here now to having this new game, new old game to play.
Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience with us. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have a lot of questions in the chat, so I want to leave plenty of time for that. And thank you again so much for joining us. All right. So Steve is here with us. I wonder if we can unmute him and do a little sound check and then go into Q&A with Tegan.
Hi, Steve. You there?
Yeah, I am.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Hello, Amy. Hello, Tegan.
Thank you so much for joining us and zooming in all the way from Tasmania. I think you win the award for the furthest zoom.
The sun is just starting to light up the trees on the horizon from here.
We got you up early this morning.
Oh, you sure did.
All right. Well, I'm going to dive into questions since we just have a few minutes here. So the first question that came in was just whether there was any experiences you've had in Tasmania that have added to your dry farming knowledge or thoughts. And I know in the video you just shared that you haven't done that much experimentation, but anything about Tasmania that's added to your thinking?
Well, what I have done is I have steadily increased the interplant spacing in my gardening. I spent the last 12 years on some very good soil, which it's a Krasnozem soil. Again, it has no bead horizon. It just gets more and more clayey as you get deeper. It's not particularly open to root penetration because the soils in Tassie, they have excess magnesium in them and the clay gets very tight. But still, there's a great moisture reserve in there. And I tried to make as much use of it as possible. And so over the years, not only have I increased the interplant spacing, but in my local book, Growing Vegetables South of Australia, I've been putting this table in where it's mostly hypothecating. It's mostly just my best guess. And I try to express that if you increase the plant spacing and you have increased soil depth, you can decrease the frequency of irrigation all the way to not irrigating at all. So I provide a gradient scale. And I suppose that's the best I've done at this point.
Right. Thank you. We have a question that's a follow-up to your comment around how dry farming is hard. And the question is, you said if you have water, you will use it, and dry farming is hard. But what about the reduction in weeding from dry farming? Is there a sweet spot of enough water to get nice yields, but to reduce weed pressure? Or have you observed some such sweet spot?
Oh, I'm going to surprise you with this answer. People who are having problems with weed pressure don't know how to sharpen a hoe. And they put their vegetables too close together, so they can't wield the hoe. If you know how to hoe and have a good workable hoe, weeds are not a problem. It doesn't matter how many of them there are. You get rid of them all right away and keep them going. If you're growing vegetables, you have to be prepared to get out there and hoe the weeds every week. It's like sweeping your floor. And if you have a proper hoe, it's not very much effort. It's no harder than sweeping a floor. I prefer a stirrup hoe, what Americans, when I was young, I used to call a hula hoe. It's like a stirrup. It has a little bit of wiggle in it so that whether you're pushing or you're pulling, the blade is presented at the right angle to cut the weeds off. And that hoe should be sharp like a knife. And if it isn't sharp like a knife, well, you get your stone out there and you sharpen it. And same with a conventional hoe, the chop sort of hoe. It should be sharp. You should almost be able to cut your finger on it. And so I don't know any way to avoid weeds. And I don't find any difference whether I irrigate or not. The weeds seem to come up and cause a problem. And usually by the middle of the summer, after I've gotten rid of the spring weeds and the early summer weeds, even though I'm irrigating, I don't see very many weeds all summer.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question is there any situation in which wider spacing could be less beneficial for dry farming success? For instance, tighter spaced tomatoes may produce less vegetative growth, but have more energy for fruit and thus less.
I can't say I have any experience with that. Like tomatoes, when I grow them, I like to put them 2 meters apart. That'd be 6.5, 7 feet apart, okay, in every direction. And they fill up the whole space. You can hardly get between the plants by the time the summer's over. And so I don't know what would happen if I put them closer together. If they're having too much trouble with vegetation, I'd say that they're not fertilizing tomatoes properly. They're probably giving them too much nitrogen.
Okay, great. And actually that connects to the next question. And I think we just have time for this one more. So there will be some additional questions unanswered in the chat, and we'll be able to follow up with those after today as well. So this one says, thanks for the presentation. Any particular full spectrum water soluble fertilizers that Steve would recommend?
Yeah, two. There's a company called Dynagrow in the United States, and they make a range of fertilizers. They do the usual cannabis grow and bloom stuff. They also make a 777, which is a sort of multi-purpose, one size fits most fertilizer that's got very adequate levels of trace elements. And in my investigations in the United States, and don't forget I do this over the internet, I have no way to access this material. I think it's the best one that I know of. There might be something in some cannabis shop that's better, but Dynagrow is also not expensive. You can buy it on Amazon even, and I recommend that. And there's a much better fertilizer than that, much better. It's called Nutritech 1010. And there is a distributor in Canada who imports Nutritech from Australia. Nutritech is designed by an Australian genius named Graham Sate, who is a generation ahead of John Kempf, who has Advancing Ecoagriculture, who's a brilliant young man. Anyway, Graham has 1010 everything is chelated, everything is complex with fulvic acids. It provides luxury levels of all the trace elements. It has some natural growth stimulants in it that the plants themselves produce to make themselves grow. It just makes the most beautiful plants you ever saw. And it costs in Canada twice as much as I pay for it here in Australia. But anybody who's serious about foliar feeding or fertigating, really look up some 1010 and give it a try.
Oh, thank you, Steve. You are just this wealth of knowledge, and I have to share that we had a social media post about you, and multiple people shared how well loved and worn your book is for them, and how they have notes and post-its on it, and it's been instrumental in their practices. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and we will probably be forwarding some questions your way to see if we can get them answered after the event. So much gratitude. Thank you so much for zooming in all the way here.
Happy to help.
Thank you so much, Steve.